Imagine a darkness so profound, it feels like it's breathing. Now imagine strange lights appearing within that darkness, pulsing with an almost intelligent rhythm. We went deep into an abandoned mine, not knowing what we'd find, and what we discovered will make you question what truly exists beyond our understanding. Are you ready to face the unknown? The town of Ridgecrest sits nestled between two mountain ranges in the forgotten corners of northern Nevada, a place where the desert meets the bones of ancient volcanic activity. Population 400 and declining. No stoplights. One church, one bar, and one mine that the locals refuse to discuss after sundown. They call it Blackwood Mine, though the original name has been lost to history, erased from county records sometime in the early 1940s for reasons that remain unclear. The entrance sits 3 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a dirt path that becomes impassable during the rainy season. When we arrived on that October morning, the sky hung low with clouds that seemed reluctant to release their burden, casting the entire landscape in shades of gray and forgotten memory. The mine itself appears as a wound in the mountainside, a rectangular gash of splintered timber and rusted iron that speaks to decades of abandonment. The main entrance frame still stands, though barely, its supports leaning at angles that defy architectural logic. Warning signs, their paint faded to near invisibility, hang from chains that have long since surrendered to corrosion. Beyond the entrance, only darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom at night or even the intimidating darkness of an unlit basement. This was something different, something that seemed to possess weight and presence, as if the absence of light had become a tangible force. But we did not travel to Ridgecrest for the mine's architecture or its history of failed copper extraction. We came because of the lights. The phenomenon was first documented in 1987 by a geological survey team conducting routine assessments of abandoned mining sites across the region. Their report, buried in county archives and largely ignored, described witnessing luminescent activity of unknown origin, approximately 300 meters below the surface. The lights, they wrote, appeared to pulse in regular intervals, lasting between 2 and 4 seconds each, with colors ranging from pale blue to deep amber. They captured no photographs. Their equipment, they claimed, malfunctioned at the precise moments the lights appeared. The survey was never completed. The team leader resigned from his position 3 weeks later and refused all subsequent interviews about the experience. Over the following decades, similar reports emerged with unsettling consistency. Hikers who strayed too close to the entrance spoke of glimpsing flickering illumination deep within the shaft. A group of teenagers who entered on a dare in 2003 emerged 40 minutes later, 2 of them refusing to speak about what they had witnessed, the third claiming the lights had seemed to follow them, appearing closer each time they looked back. In 2011, a documentary crew attempted to investigate, but their footage proved inconclusive, showing only brief frames of distorted luminescence that experts dismissed as camera artifacts or deliberate manipulation. What caught our attention was not the lights themselves, but the pattern that emerged when we compiled every recorded sighting spanning 35 years. The pulse intervals, when plotted on a timeline, revealed something that sent a chill through our research team. They were accelerating. Whatever was creating these lights was becoming more active, more frequent, as if building towards something none of us wanted to contemplate. We spent 4 months preparing for this expedition. Elena Vasquez, our technical specialist, assembled a collection of recording equipment specifically designed to function in low-light, high-humidity environments. Standard electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras capable of operating in complete darkness, audio equipment sensitive enough to capture frequencies below the range of human hearing. Thomas Brennan, a geologist with 17 years of field experience, joined our team to provide scientific context and to eliminate natural explanations before we considered anything beyond conventional understanding. I led the expedition, though leadership felt like a fragile concept when facing something that had resisted explanation for nearly 4 decades. The geological maps spread across our research table told a story of ambitious extraction and sudden abandonment. Blackwood Mine had operated for less than 8 years before the company that owned it filed for bankruptcy and sealed the entrance. Official records cited depleted copper deposits and unsafe structural conditions. Unofficial accounts, gathered from elderly residents who remembered the final years of operation, suggested something more troubling. Miners had reported hearing sounds from below, sounds that could not be attributed to equipment or shifting rock. Several workers had refused to descend past certain depths, accepting termination rather than returning to the deeper tunnels. And then there were the lights, mentioned in passing by a former foreman in a 1978 interview with a local historian. Lights that appeared where no electrical infrastructure existed. Lights that seemed to watch. What strikes you first about Ridgecrest is the silence. Desert communities often possess a particular quietude, but this felt different. Imposed rather than natural. As if the landscape itself had agreed to keep certain secrets. The locals we approached for information proved polite but evasive, their eyes flickering toward the mountain whenever we mentioned the mine. One elderly woman, running the only operational gas station, offered a warning that stayed with me long after we departed. She said that some holes in the earth go deeper than measurement can reach, and not all of them lead down. She did not elaborate, and when we pressed for clarification, she simply shook her head and retreated into the back room of her establishment. We set up our base camp approximately 500 meters from the mine entrance, close enough to minimize equipment transport but far enough to maintain a clear line of sight to our vehicles should rapid departure become necessary. The first night passed without incident, though none of us slept well. Thomas blamed the altitude. Elena suggested unfamiliar surroundings. I kept my observations to myself, but I could not shake the sensation of being observed, as if something within that dark entrance had already taken note of our arrival and was waiting to see what we would do next. The morning of our descent arrived with unexpected clarity, the clouds from the previous day having retreated during the night. Sunlight struck the mine entrance at an angle that seemed to deepen rather than illuminate the darkness within. Equipment checks consumed 2 hours. Safety protocols were reviewed multiple times. And then, with recording devices activated and communication systems tested, we approached the mouth of Blackwood Mine and prepared to enter a darkness that had been keeping its secrets for longer than any of us had been alive. What we found inside would challenge everything we thought we understood about the boundaries between the known and the impossible. But that descent, and the horrors that awaited us in the depths, would prove to be only the beginning of a nightmare that continues to haunt us to this day. The air changed the moment we crossed the threshold. Outside, the October breeze carried the dry scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Inside, the atmosphere became something else entirely. Heavy. What? Carrying a metallic taste that coated the tongue and refused to dissipate no matter how many times we swallowed. Our headlamps cut narrow beams through the darkness, revealing timber supports that sagged under the weight of decades, their surfaces blooming with fungal growth in patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their arrangement. Thomas led the descent, his geological expertise making him the logical choice for identifying unstable terrain. Elena followed, her camera already recording, the red light on its housing a small beacon of technological reassurance in the growing darkness. I brought up the rear, my attention divided between the path ahead and the shrinking rectangle of daylight behind us that represented our connection to the world above. Within the first 50 meters, that rectangle had diminished to the size of a postage stamp. Within 100 meters, It had vanished entirely, swallowed by the curves and angles of the descending shaft. The infrastructure of the mine told a story of hasty departure. Tools remained where they had been dropped, their surfaces corroded but recognizable. Mining carts sat on rusted tracks, some still containing fragments of excavated rock that had never been transported to the surface. Work lights, long dead, hung from overhead beams at irregular intervals, their cables trailing into the darkness like the tendrils of some dormant creature. Everything suggested that the workers who had once labored here had left quickly, perhaps without adequate warning, abandoning their equipment and their livelihood in a single moment of collective departure. Thomas stopped at the 200-meter mark, his headlamp focused on a section of wall where the natural rock had been exposed by previous excavation. He traced his fingers across the surface, and I watched his expression shift from professional curiosity to something approaching confusion. The rock formation, he explained, was wrong. Not the type of geological structure one would expect at this depth in this region. The patterns suggested significant volcanic activity, but the dating would have to place such activity within the last 200 years, which contradicted everything known about the area's geological history. He took samples, placing them carefully into collection bags, but his movements had become hesitant, uncertain in a way that was unlike him. Elena called our attention to the audio readings she was monitoring through her headphones. Background noise in subterranean environments typically consists of dripping water, settling rock, perhaps the distant movement of underground streams. What her equipment was capturing fell outside these parameters. Low-frequency vibrations, barely audible to the human ear, pulsing at intervals that matched the descriptions from the 1987 Geological Survey report. Something deep within the mine was producing sound, and that sound carried a rhythm that felt disturbingly intentional. We pressed deeper, the angle of descent increasing as we moved beyond the sections of the mine that had been reinforced by human construction. Here, the tunnel transitioned from rectangular passages supported by timber to natural cavities in the rock, pathways that had existed long before any mining operation had discovered them. The original miners had simply followed these natural formations. Expanding them were necessary, but the core structure remained ancient beyond measurement. Stalactites hung from overhead, their surfaces glistening with moisture that caught our headlamps and scattered the light in unexpected directions. At 300 meters, Elena stopped mid-step and extended her arm in a gesture that demanded immediate silence. We complied, cutting our headlamps to reduce visual interference. In the absolute darkness that followed, I became aware of my own heartbeat, the sound of blood rushing through my ears, the slight wheeze of breath that suddenly seemed far too loud for the circumstances. And then I saw it. A pulse of light, faint but unmistakable, somewhere in the depths ahead of us. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, a gentle blue luminescence that seemed to emanate from the rock itself rather than from any identifiable source. The color reminded me of bioluminescent organisms in deep ocean footage, but we were hundreds of meters below solid ground, in an environment that should have been incapable of supporting any form of life that produced its own light. The pulse faded, leaving us once again in darkness, but the image remained burned into my vision, an afterglow that persisted despite the absence of continued stimulus. Elena's camera had captured it. We reviewed the footage immediately, huddled together in the narrow passage with the small screen providing our only illumination. The recording confirmed what our eyes had witnessed. A distinct pulse of blue light, originating from a point approximately 50 meters ahead of our position, lasting exactly 2.3 seconds before dissipating. No sound accompanied the phenomenon. No corresponding temperature change registered on our thermal sensors. The light had simply appeared, held steady for its brief duration, and then vanished as if it had never existed. Thomas offered the first natural explanation that occurred to him: triboluminescence, the generation of light through mechanical stress on certain crystalline structures. Mining activity could have fractured quartz deposits in ways that continued to produce occasional flashes of illumination decades after the original disturbance. But even as he spoke, his voice carried a quality of forced conviction, and I could see in his eyes that he did not fully believe his own hypothesis. The light had been too steady, too uniform, too precise in its duration to result from random geological stress. We advanced toward the point of origin, moving slowly now, our senses heightened by the confirmation that the phenomenon we had traveled to investigate was real and present. The tunnel widened as we approached, opening into a chamber of significant size that our headlamps struggled to fully illuminate. The walls here bore markings that demanded closer examination. Not the natural patterns of mineral deposits or the artificial scars of mining tools, but something between. Geometric shapes that repeated at irregular intervals, spirals that seemed to follow mathematical progressions, angular symbols that resembled no written language any of us had ever encountered. Thomas photographed the markings while Elena scanned them with her equipment, searching for any indication that they might be modern additions or elaborate hoaxes. Her analysis suggested otherwise. The markings were old, possibly predating the mining operation by significant margins, carved into rock surfaces that showed no signs of recent disturbance. Whoever or whatever had created them had done so long before any human had set foot in these tunnels. And then the lights returned. Not a single pulse this time, but 3 separate points of illumination appearing simultaneously at different locations within the chamber. Blue, amber, and something between that our vocabulary struggled to describe. They pulsed in sequence, creating a pattern that felt uncomfortably deliberate, as if communicating something we lacked the capacity to understand. The temperature in the chamber dropped noticeably, and I became aware of a pressure building behind my eyes, a sensation not unlike the onset of a severe headache but somehow external rather than internal in origin. We stood frozen, watching the lights cycle through their sequence 3 times before fading once more into darkness. The silence that followed felt absolute, as if even the ambient sounds of the underground had been suppressed to emphasize the significance of what we had just witnessed. Something down here was aware of our presence, and it was responding. We established a secondary observation point within the chamber, deploying our full array of recording equipment in an attempt to capture and analyze the phenomena with scientific rigor. Elena positioned 6 cameras at strategic angles, each equipped with motion sensors and low-light enhancement capable of recording in conditions that would render standard equipment useless. Thomas installed seismic monitors designed to detect even the slightest vibrations in the surrounding rock, hoping to establish whether the lights correlated with any geological activity. I maintained communication with our surface team, though transmissions became increasingly unreliable the longer we remained at depth. The first 3 hours passed without incident. We recorded ambient conditions, noted temperature fluctuations, and documented the unusual markings on the chamber walls with high-resolution photography that we hoped would allow for later analysis by specialists in ancient languages and symbolism. The atmosphere remained oppressive but stable, and I began to wonder whether our earlier sighting had been a fortunate coincidence, a rare occurrence that might not repeat during our limited observation window. Then the equipment began to behave strangely. Camera 3, positioned to monitor the deepest section of the chamber, started recording interference patterns that should have been impossible given its shielding against electromagnetic disturbance. The footage showed waves of static that pulsed at regular intervals, creating bands of distortion that moved across the frame like ripples on water. Elena attempted to diagnose the malfunction remotely, running diagnostics through her portable computer, but every system check returned normal results. The camera was functioning perfectly. The interference was coming from something in the environment itself. The seismic monitors Thomas had installed recorded a low-frequency vibration that built gradually over a period of approximately 4 minutes. Not the sharp spikes associated with geological settling or the gradual waves produced by distant tectonic activity. This was something rhythmic, something that pulsed with an almost biological regularity, like the heartbeat of something immense buried deep within the rock. Thomas cross-referenced the readings with his database of known geological phenomena and found no matches. Whatever was producing this vibration existed outside the documented boundaries of natural underground activity. And then the lights returned with an intensity that made our previous sightings seem like a mere prelude. They emerged from the walls themselves, pushing through the solid rock as if it offered no resistance. Points of blue and amber luminescence that grew brighter with each passing second. There were dozens of them now, scattered across the chamber in an arrangement that defied random distribution. They formed patterns, geometric shapes that echoed the markings carved into the rock, spirals and angles that seemed to pulse in coordination with each other. The temperature dropped sharply, our breath becoming visible in the cold air, and I experienced that pressure behind my eyes again, stronger now, accompanied by a high-pitched tone at the edge of hearing. Elena attempted to capture audio recordings of the tone, adjusting her equipment to focus on the frequency range that seemed most active. What she recorded would haunt us long after we left the mine. The sound, when played back at reduced speed, contained variations that resembled structured communication. Not language as we understand it, not words or sentences, but patterns of modulation that suggested information being transmitted. Something was communicating, and the lights appeared to be a visible component of that communication. We systematically attempted to eliminate natural explanations. Geological pressure, the obvious first candidate, failed to account for the rhythmic nature of the pulses or their response to our movements within the chamber. When Thomas walked toward one cluster of lights, they dimmed and retreated. When he stepped back, they brightened and advanced. This was not pressure release. This was reaction. Trapped gases, another common explanation for subterranean luminescence, could not produce the sustained, controlled illumination we were witnessing. The lights burned without consuming oxygen, without generating detectable heat, without any of the chemical signatures associated with natural combustion or oxidation. Bioluminescence remained a theoretical possibility, but the conditions necessary to support light-producing organisms were entirely absent from this environment. No water sources, no organic matter, no chemical gradients that could fuel metabolic processes. The rock itself was barren of anything approaching biological activity, and yet the lights continued to pulse with a vitality that suggested something very much alive. The lights began to move. Not randomly, not drifting, but with purpose. They organized themselves into formations that swept across the chamber in coordinated waves, creating the impression of something vast and distributed becoming aware of itself, gathering its scattered components into a coherent whole. The pattern they formed was unmistakable. A spiral, rotating slowly, its arms extending toward the three of us where we stood at the center of the chamber. Thomas made a sound that I had never heard from him before, something between a gasp and a word that never quite formed. He pointed toward the deepest section of the chamber, where the spiral appeared to originate, and I followed his gesture to witness something that I struggle to describe even now. The lights were not simply appearing from the rock. They were emerging from a fissure, a crack in the chamber floor that descended beyond the reach of our headlamps, beyond any depth we could measure with our available equipment. They rose from that darkness in streams, rivers of luminescence that fed into the spiral pattern, and for a moment I had the overwhelming impression that we were witnessing something emerging, something that had been waiting in depths we could not comprehend, finally responding to the presence of observers. Our instruments recorded unprecedented levels of electromagnetic activity. The atmospheric pressure fluctuated wildly, shifting between values that should have been mutually exclusive within seconds of each other. And beneath it all, that rhythmic vibration continued, faster now, its pulse quickening as if matching the accelerating intensity of the light display. Elena's voice cut through my paralysis with a single word: ascending. She was right. Whatever was happening was building toward something, and we had no understanding of what that climax might entail or what our presence might mean to whatever was orchestrating this display. We made the decision to retreat to a safer observation distance, backing away from the spiral pattern while maintaining visual contact with the phenomenon. The lights did not pursue us, but they tracked our movement, sections of the spiral elongating toward our retreating forms as if reaching, testing, evaluating. When we stopped, they stopped. When we moved, they responded. We were not simply observing. We were being observed in return. And whatever was watching us from within those lights was learning. We established a temporary position in one of the narrower passages leading to the main chamber, close enough to monitor the phenomenon but separated by sufficient distance to provide an illusion of safety. The lights had stabilized after our retreat, returning to their scattered arrangement across the chamber walls, pulsing with that familiar rhythm but no longer forming the coordinated patterns that had so disturbed us. Elena reviewed her recordings while Thomas attempted to make sense of the geological data that contradicted everything his training had prepared him to expect. The question that consumed our discussion was deceptively simple. What were we dealing with? Thomas presented the first hypothesis, approaching the question from his area of expertise. Unknown geological activity, he suggested, perhaps involving mineral compositions or physical processes that had never been documented. The lights could represent some form of piezoelectric discharge, energy released when crystalline structures are subjected to mechanical stress. It was a reasonable explanation, grounded in established science, but it failed to account for the responsive behavior we had witnessed. Crystals do not reorganize themselves in reaction to observers. Piezoelectric discharge does not form patterns that track movement. Elena offered an alternative drawn from her background in technical systems. What if the lights represented some form of natural phenomenon that possessed emergent properties mimicking intelligence? Like the way flocking birds or schooling fish create complex patterns through simple individual rules, perhaps the lights were governed by fundamental principles that created the appearance of coordinated behavior without any underlying consciousness directing them. It was an attractive hypothesis, one that allowed us to remain within the comfortable boundaries of natural explanation, but something about it felt incomplete. The patterns had been too precise, too responsive, too clearly directed at us specifically. I found myself drawn to possibilities that neither of my companions seemed willing to articulate. The historical record contained numerous accounts of unexplained subterranean lights, phenomena reported across cultures and continents spanning thousands of years. The will-o'-the-wisp of European folklore, the Min-Min lights of Australian Aboriginal tradition, the mysterious illuminations reported in caves and mines throughout Asia and the Americas. These accounts shared common elements that transcended cultural interpretation. Lights that appeared in darkness. Lights that seemed to possess awareness. Lights that led travelers deeper into unknown territories. What if these stories described something real? Not ghosts or spirits in the supernatural sense, but something that existed in the spaces between our categories, something that had been present long before humans evolved the language to describe it? Thomas rejected this line of thinking immediately, but his rejection carried an undertone of fear rather than scientific certainty. We were trained to seek explanations within the boundaries of known physics, known biology, known chemistry. Stepping outside those boundaries meant entering territory where our expertise offered no protection, where we became observers rather than analysts, subjects of investigation rather than investigators. Elena consulted her research files, pulling up documented cases that bore similarities to what we were experiencing. The Hessdalen lights in Norway, unexplained luminous phenomena that had been scientifically observed since the 1930s without any definitive explanation being established. The Brown Mountain lights in North Carolina, another persistent phenomenon that had resisted decades of investigation. The Min Min lights of Australia, which had been reported by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European contact, added additional witnesses to the record. In each case, the lights displayed characteristics that defied easy explanation. They appeared in locations that lacked conventional energy sources. They exhibited behavior that suggested reaction to observers. They persisted across generational timescales, appearing to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of initial witnesses with unchanged characteristics. Whatever produced these phenomena was not temporary or incidental. It was stable, enduring, and apparently unconcerned with our attempts to understand it. The implications troubled me in ways I struggled to articulate. If something intelligent existed in the depths of this mine, something that had been present long before human activity began and would presumably remain long after we departed, what did that suggest about the nature of consciousness? About the boundaries of life? About what else might exist in the hidden places of the earth that we assume to be empty and dead? Thomas interrupted my speculation with an observation that shifted the focus of our discussion. His seismic data showed something unexpected. The vibrations we had been recording originated from a depth far exceeding the known extent of the mine. The shaft had been excavated to approximately 400 meters before operations ceased. The vibrations came from somewhere below 800 meters, possibly deeper. Whatever was producing them existed in chambers or cavities that no human had ever entered, in darkness that had never known even the temporary intrusion of artificial light. What had the original miners encountered that drove them to abandon a profitable operation without warning? What had they seen or sensed that convinced them the risks of continued excavation outweighed any potential rewards? The official record spoke of structural instability and depleted deposits, but those explanations rang hollow against the evidence of abrupt departure that surrounded us in the form of abandoned equipment and discarded personal items. Elena made a discovery that added another layer to the mystery. Among the recordings she had made of the chamber walls, several captured sections of the geometric markings in high enough resolution to allow for detailed analysis. Running these images through pattern recognition software designed to identify similarities to known symbol systems, she found something unexpected. The shapes bore statistically significant resemblance to markings discovered in cave systems on 4 different continents. Markings that had been dated to periods ranging from 8,000 to 40,000 years ago. Whatever had created the symbols in this chamber had also been present in ancient caves across the globe, leaving traces of its existence that predated recorded human history by millennia. We were not dealing with a local phenomenon or a recent development. We were encountering something that had coexisted with humanity throughout our entire existence as a species. Something that had watched us evolve from primitive hunters to technological civilization without ever revealing itself directly. And now, for reasons we could not understand, it was responding to our presence with increasing intensity. The lights in the main chamber began to pulse again, faster than before, their rhythm matching the accelerating beat of my heart. We returned to the chamber because we had no choice. The data we had collected was insufficient to support any definitive conclusions, and the phenomenon had already demonstrated that our mere presence seemed to stimulate its activity. If we wanted answers, we would have to seek them at the source, regardless of the risks that decision might entail. Thomas objected, citing safety concerns and the inadequacy of our equipment, but even his objections carried a quality of resignation. We had come too far to retreat without making one final attempt to understand what we were facing. The lights greeted our return with an intensity that exceeded anything we had previously witnessed. They bloomed from every surface, filling the chamber with an illumination that rendered our headlamps unnecessary. Blue and amber and that indescribable third color washed across the walls, the ceiling, the floor, creating an environment that felt less like a geological formation and more like the interior of something alive. The temperature had dropped further, our breath forming clouds that hung in the air longer than they should have, as if time itself was being affected by whatever force governed this space. Elena positioned herself near the chamber entrance, her equipment recording everything, while Thomas and I advanced toward the fissure from which the light seemed to originate. The spiral pattern we had observed earlier reformed as we approached, but this time it did not simply track our movement. It responded to it, creating pathways of intensified light that seemed to guide us toward specific positions within the chamber. When I deviated from the suggested path, the lights dimmed in my new direction and brightened along the route they apparently wanted me to follow. I cannot adequately explain why I chose to accept this guidance. Perhaps curiosity overwhelmed caution. Perhaps the phenomenon possessed some quality that influenced my decision-making in ways I could not perceive. Whatever the reason, I followed the path of light toward the fissure, and as I drew closer, the nature of the phenomenon began to reveal itself in ways that challenged my fundamental understanding of reality. The fissure was not simply a crack in the rock. It was a boundary, a threshold between the environment I understood and something else entirely. The lights rose from beyond that threshold, and as I peered into the darkness below, I perceived depth that should have been impossible. Not the depth of a cave or a shaft or any geological formation I had ever encountered. This was depth of another order entirely, a descent into darkness so profound that it seemed to curve away from normal space, to fold into dimensions that my eyes were not designed to perceive. And within that depth, something looked back. I cannot describe what I saw because my mind refused to process it fully, protecting itself from impressions that threatened to overwhelm its capacity for comprehension. I received fragments, pieces of a whole that suggested something vast and ancient and fundamentally incompatible with human understanding. The lights were not the phenomenon itself. They were its surface expression, the only portion of its existence that could manifest in the three-dimensional space we inhabited. What lay beneath, what extended into those impossible depths, remained forever beyond my ability to grasp. The phenomenon spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in that pressure behind my eyes that I had felt from the beginning, translated now into something approaching meaning. It was old. Older than the rock that surrounded it, older than the mountain that contained that rock, older than the tectonic processes that had formed the continent on which I stood. It had existed before life emerged on this planet and would continue to exist long after life had run its course. It was not hostile, not in any sense that I could recognize, but neither was it benevolent. It simply was, and our presence registered on its awareness as something brief and temporary, like the passage of a single bacterium across the surface of a human body. It had watched humanity from the beginning. It had seen us paint images on cave walls and discover fire and build civilizations and tear them down again. It had observed our wars, our art, our science, our religions. All of it had passed before its attention like moments in a dream, too brief to engage with directly, too ephemeral to warrant response. But something was changing. Something in the pattern of human activity had begun to attract its interest in ways that had not occurred before. The lights we were witnessing, the increased activity documented over the past decades, represented attention. It was watching us more closely now for reasons it did not explain. Thomas was calling my name, his voice distant and distorted, as if reaching me through water rather than air. I felt his hand on my shoulder, pulling me back from the fissure, and as I retreated, the connection faded. The pressure behind my eyes diminished. The fragments of impossible understanding that had momentarily assembled themselves dissolved back into confusion, leaving only the memory of contact and the certainty that what I had experienced was real. Elena had recorded everything, but when we reviewed the footage later, what the camera had captured bore no resemblance to what I had perceived. The recording showed me standing at the edge of the fissure, motionless, staring into darkness for approximately 7 minutes while the lights pulsed around me in patterns that the software could not analyze. My face, when visible, displayed an expression that Elena described as transcendent and Thomas called horrifying. I had been somewhere else during those 7 minutes, somewhere the camera could not follow. We ascended from Blackwood Mine as the afternoon light began to fail, climbing back through the decaying tunnels and abandoned infrastructure with a shared understanding that we would not return. The lights had not harmed us. Whatever existed in those depths had not sought to prevent our departure. But we had been marked by the experience, changed in ways that we were only beginning to understand. The darkness behind us seemed to breathe as we climbed, and I could not shake the sensation that something was still watching, still waiting, still considering what to do about the brief visitors who had dared to descend into its domain. The questions we carried with us back to the surface would never receive satisfying answers. What was the phenomenon that manifested as lights in Blackwood Mine? Where had it come from, and what was its purpose, if purpose even applied to something so far beyond human categories? Why had its activity increased over recent decades, and what implications did that increase carry for the future of our species? We had gathered data, recorded observations, collected samples, and none of it brought us closer to genuine understanding. Some mysteries resist resolution. Some boundaries exist not to be crossed but to remind us that our knowledge, however advanced it might seem, represents only a fraction of what exists beyond our perception. The lights continue to pulse in the depths of Blackwood Mine, and whatever watches from within them continues to observe a world that remains largely unaware of its presence. We have shared our findings with colleagues who specialize in unexplained phenomena, and plans are being developed for future expeditions with more sophisticated equipment and larger teams. But I wonder whether any amount of technology or personnel will succeed where we failed. The entity beneath the mine does not hide from investigation. It simply exists on a scale that makes investigation irrelevant, a scale where human inquiry represents nothing more than a brief flicker of curiosity from creatures too limited to comprehend what they are observing. If you have experienced something similar, if you have witnessed lights in places where no lights should exist or felt the presence of something ancient watching from darkness, we want to hear your account. Perhaps by gathering enough testimonies, enough data, enough evidence, we can begin to assemble a picture of what shares this planet with us, what has always shared this planet with us, what waits in the deep places of the earth for reasons we may never understand. The darkness beneath Blackwood Mine is patient. It has been waiting for millions of years, and it will continue to wait long after we are gone. The only question that remains is what it is waiting for, and whether we will live long enough to discover the answer.